One must not flirt with one's destiny.
Stop it! You're ignorant.
I'm so glad to talk to film scholar, filmmaker, and podcaster Mtume Gant. Thank you for being here.
Pleasure to be here. Very, very much looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you. Me too. Quentin Tarantino, why are we talking about him? It seems to me like he's constantly in the news because he seems not to be able to make his 10th and final film, and we will get into that. I watched his films when I was the first time when I was 16 years old, and I watched Reservoir Dogs. And when you're 16, you're an adolescent. That does something to you, and it does shape your experience with cinema in general, with independent film, and with violence in film in particular. And so I'd like to ask you how old were you when you watched your first Tarantino film, and what film was
Yeah.
that?
So I'm 46. When Reservoir Dogs came out, I was 12. I was aware of the movie, but my memory will do a disservice to me as to when I actually saw it. The thing I did see before all of it is Natural Born Killers, which he wrote. And that because that film, I'm also a big hip hop person. And that film was heavily invoked in a lot of hip hop music. There was like this like Dr. Dre and Ice Cube, Natural Born Killers kind of thing that they did, and the kind of like hyper violence. And I wasn't aware that he wrote it until even really of who he was. He was still kind of like a thing. But Oliver Stone, who directed the film, was someone that I kind of revered in like my kind of like burgeoning smarts, 12, 13, 14. And then Pulp Fiction was probably the first that I saw. But it was definitely when I became aware of him because in what I forget what year is that, 95, I believe,
Pulp
that
Fiction
Pulp
is
Fiction comes out.
95.
95. Here in the States, it was the biggest brouhaha. I mean, it was like a real cultural moment. So many different wings of cultural kind of, energies were attaching to it. I think the other thing about that film is it's two of its main stars, Samuel L. Jackson and John Travolta, having very weird careers prior to that film. I think people don't really remember that. Travolta really being a failed star before Pulp Fiction, right? He was someone who was supposed to be major and then had like one of the biggest drop off the cliffs. People thought Travolta was over. This relaunches Travolta. Sam Jackson, largely a character actor at that point, the only real and even small part character actor. Um, Really, the film that he does before that gave him some juice, and this is what I think brought a lot of black people to Pulp Fiction, is his role in Jungle Fever, which had a lot of cachet with people, and including me. I mean, it's a role that had a lot of I think legend amongst like black movie watchers, and being in a Spike Lee film, I think also does that. So he does this. They do this film, and it's like the thing to see. I mean, I think it's either the beginning of it's somewhere between my freshman and sophomore year of high school, where the kind of consumption of media. I'm listening to hip hop, which also has a big violent thing. Pulp Fiction becomes this big like kind of cultural moment, so you have to see it. Um, and in my kind of like young impressionable state, I thought it was very cool. Mainly because I think this is kind of how identity politics and a kind of like representational politics work because Sam is in it. You also have Ving Rhames in it, right? You have like this like black presence, um, and they're next to these kind of like white actors, people like Harvey Keitel, who I had like a bit of a thing with by that time because Taxi Driver and his kind of like Scorsese cachets and so forth and so on. There's a way that black people feel included in this kind of like new like kind of pop culture craziness. So like that was the film, and somewhere in there I watched Reservoir Dogs too. But I might have watched it before it because I heard about it and I wasn't able to go to the theater yet. So it was like around the same time I watched those two. And they became like kind of like a couplet of movies that were a big deal, along with True Romance, which became a big like high school thing. So like these kind of like early Tarantino things were like this soup of like high prestige for I would say like my eighth grade to 10th grade self.
It's funny that you said it felt like a couplet to you because for me it was the same because I um, there was Jackie Brown, but it didn't really fit in, in my 18-year-old perception because um, it wasn't that violent, and
Hmm.
I understood Tarantino to be the guy who would build all these scenes, they were built towards a violent outburst, and that was kind of the thing, and that was what kind of fascinated me as a young man, because it was like I never saw that someone would build towards it in such a way, and fill the space with so much seemingly random and banal stuff, like the dialogue, the conversations about
Hmm.
about nothing really. But it was like this well-oiled machinery towards the great violent outburst. And that's how I saw those two films. That's how they felt to me. And Jackie Brown was very different from that, but we can get into that.
But
Um,
to that point, I just want to say one thing. I think it's a very interesting point you're bringing up here. There's like this thing because think about our age frame of those kind of movies when you're a teenager and you're trying to find a way to be cool, representational, like hip discourse. Think about his catchphrases and things like that. I had a guy. This probably wouldn't in Europe mean anything to you, but the whole thing with the mayonnaise, right, on the fries, right, thing became a thing in the US because of that movie. And it was largely because of teenagers wanting to kind of show evidence that they saw that they were part of this kind of hip cultural thing, putting mayonnaise on their fries, and like Royale with cheese and things like this, being able to kind of like say these kind of like phrases to kind of show that you're culturally aware. And I just think it's very interesting, and it's these like these this like long dialogue. Um, we can probably talk more about it at another time if we get to more like his aesthetics, but. I also think within the United States in the 90s, and you could give him a lot of credit or discredit for it. Um, this idea of like cool discourse and cool like jabbering becomes something that has heavy purchase in the United States in the 90s going into the aughts. I mean, it's seeming like the summit of movie making and kind of like cultural. How cool can you talk and how much can you like say shit? That's like, gonna be catchphrases.
Exactly, and it was even a big influence on some German filmmakers, believe it or not. I mean, you might have heard of Til Schweiger, who was in Inglourious Basterds. He was one of the resistance guys, and he's one of the most successful German actors and directors. And one
Interesting.
of his first big roles were in films like one's called Knocking on Heaven's Door, and the other is his directorial debut, The Ice Bear. And it's basically a Tarantino ripoff. It's nothing else. And there were other films like that. And of course, Germany is not the exception. You had this thing in the US. I mean, there were films like Things to Do in Denver When You're Dead,
Yeah,
stuff like
2 days
this.
in the valley.
Yes, yes. And
Movies
though
that people don't even remember.
exactly. And this Peter Green film, by Nick Gomez, I forgot the
Yeah,
title.
I
But
know exactly what you're talking about. Yes.
yeah, I tried to watch that, but after 30 minutes, I had to turn it off.
It's not good. It's not
Nah,
good.
no, no, it didn't really age well. And I would argue the Tarantino films didn't really age well as well for me. And I can tell you why. Especially, thing like Reservoir Dogs. I've heard recently, no, I've been hearing this for quite some time now, that Tarantino wanted to do Reservoir Dogs on the stage. And
I've heard this.
this was so insane because, I mean, this film, the dialogue is excruciating. It's
Yeah.
it's terrible. And of course, like 30 years later, you don't find it charming, when people talk about this Madonna song that way, and things like this. And and those dialogue scenes, they just go on and on and on, and they never stop. And the only interesting thing about Reservoir Dogs for me is, is the cast. The cast is great. I love those guys. They're incredible. And I don't know without them, but I have to say, as a director, he did a very good job by not showing everything, by restraining
hmm
himself. In my opinion, I think it's very good. But the material, the material itself, pooh.
I mean, it's cliche. I mean, Reservoir Dogs is a very cliche kind of kitsch film. Um, and it's definitely made by a person who has never committed a crime in his life, you know.
But he
Um,
read a lot of crime novels,
but
and
he
you can
re
see that.
crime novels, yeah, exactly, and you see the imprint on that. I agree with you on the actors. I mean, Chris Penn, I have always said, is it was a wildly underrated actor. Phenomenal. His work, The Funeral with Abel Ferrara. Oh, he's
Yeah.
great. He's
Oh, yeah.
really a great actor. Tim Roth, that was peak of his powers, Tim Roth. Really, really great work. Madsen was never a versatile actor, but he was very good at like his thing that he was able to do. And I mean, and Buscemi. He was really good at doing a thing, right? And I think he also caught a lot of those guys at a moment where all of their careers were at these interesting fault lines or interesting lines where like it could easily lose it for them, right? They were very hungry, essentially. And one thing about actors is, especially in Hollywood, is the Hollywood actor can really feel like comfortable in a role that is demanding in like things like memorizing your lines and like looking cool, but is like not that demanding in terms of like actual deep work. There's no real deep work that has to be done there, right? There's no, you know, diving into other parts of yourself, really having larger ideas. It's largely bullshit kitsch. So the most you have to do is be kind of yourself, right? And listen and know your words, right? And go through it, right? And really go through it and play the best part of yourself. So I think for a lot of these actors, because like I haven't looked at it in a long time. I did once look at like a making of it. I know the budget wasn't very high. I'm sure they had to shoot it very, 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 very quickly. It's very early Miramax and how they were kind of their mode of production at that time of like trying to kind of mix things up, in terms of like how they were kind of like spending money. But I will, yeah. So I say all that to say, it's interesting in that way, but I agree it doesn't age. I haven't watched it in quite a while. The last time I tried to watch it, I didn't actually finish it. I found that just the exploration provided no real like why am I doing this other than a kind of revisiting of what I thought I was cool when I was a teenager and like that's you could do that in your memory. You don't need to like do 2 hours of a movie, especially when you get into also the race stuff, which we could talk about at some point. I did quickly get off the train though with Tarantino by the time I was about 16, 17. I got off very quickly. Um, One Spike Lee, who I have my major challenges with. I'm not a Spike Lee endorser. People who know my work know Spike Lee is someone I have major challenges with. But when he did confront the use of the N-word, it was a topic of conversation, and Tarantino's response to it was just a kind of like, no, 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 no. So then when Jackie Brown comes out, there is this kind of thing that doesn't really make sense. The fetish becomes really evident. And in kind of like my own social and political awakening that was happening around the time of that movie, I quickly got off the train. Um, and and I would say as the decades have gone on, it's gone through a various levels of disdain for him as a maker.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Jackie Brown is an interesting case because on the one hand, it's a more mature film, I would say, and I do think that he treats Pam Grier with lots of respect, and and I think it's very cool that she got this role in the end. But but yeah, obviously. The fetish became kind of evident. And when Jackie Brown came out, and I saw it maybe 4 or 5 years later, I didn't really, that wasn't really a thing in Germany yet, because the early aughties, in Germany, it was still kind of a politically incorrect time, but that came through culture. And saying things like the N-word, it was still kind of edgy, at this point. And of course, for you, I mean, as a student, it was just a word, and I didn't even know black people, where I grew up. There weren't any. So there wasn't anybody, who could tell me, I actually don't like this, and I can tell you why. There wasn't anybody like that, and but yeah, but let's talk about Spike Lee's reaction. And it's interesting. I sent you this link, this snippet about Tarantino talking to Charlie Rose, about this thing, and he made this very weird comparison.
And when Spike Lee comes along and says, why is he using in his screenplay the N-word so much and putting it in Samuel L. Jackson's mouth, what do you say?
What I say is that's two questions, actually, all right? And you got to find out exactly which question he's asking. If he's asking, if he believes in his heart of hearts that I'm a racist, that's one thing. Okay, if he doesn't believe in his heart of hearts, and he knows that's not the case.
Yeah, he knows that.
All right, yeah. Okay, if he doesn't believe that, then it's not has nothing to do with that. It's simply about me being a writer now. All right, and as a writer, I demand the right to write any character in the world that I want to write. And I demand the right to be them, I demand the right to think them, and I demand to tell the truth as I see they are. All right? And to say that I can't do that because I'm white, but the Hughes brothers can do that because they're black, that is racist. That is the heart of racism.
And then he says that's racism. And that's real racism, that I cannot say the N-word. And, now I can laugh about it, but it's really outrageous. It's an outrageous thing to say.
Yeah, it is. But what I will say is it was very consistent with a certain, I think, developing politics that come through the 90s into the aughts. Is I think you have to do a little bit of charting here. If you think about the largely political cinema that existed in the 60s and the 70s, somewhere like Germany, right? Think about like there was a certain exploration around what power meant. Not saying that everyone got it right, right? And to be provocative, even if it was a misstep, was a tied to a kind of like political principle, right? You're thinking about all these different like cinematic movements that were happening in Western Europe, or you're thinking about the global South, third cinema, all that type of stuff, right? We can debate if the politics were good or not with each film, but there was a principle. When you get to about the 80s, and especially the US, where genre film kind of takes over, and you have a variance of filmmakers who would kind of like hide their politics or like suggest their politics within stuff, right? Even someone like Carpenter, right? Who I'm not going to say was ever really on the left, but Carpenter, for all of his like, oh, don't take me so seriously, the guy has political ideas. He's just being. I think he's like downplaying himself a little bit. I think he's actually being not like shy almost.
Sure.
Or you have very right wing 80s stuff, the Rambos and all this type of stuff, canon, right? Very, very right wing and racist, sexist, imperialist, just really bad politics. So when you kind of and Tarantino's like raised in this kind of like soupy kind of like era, right? What we have to think about with Tarantino is he's also a mix of people who were raised with a lot of that stuff and also some stuff previous, because I think people like Leone are very important to him, and I think we'll probably get to that at some point. When you hit the 90s, you hit the kind of end of Reagan, you get into Clinton, and there is no real solid like political grounding on anything. I mean, the issue with Spike making that statement, where he is fundamentally like correct to like say about Tarantino, is Spike had his own critics within the left of the black left. So he's not really coming from a political perspective that's like really robust either. Spike has his own challenges, right? While he's making a good read, he's not the ideal spokesperson, because like, in a way, Tarantino can kind of flip him off and be like, "Look, you in this Hollywood shit just like me, dude, right? And this is all BS, right?" And the Hughes brothers is an interesting people to bring, thinking about like Menace to Society, right? Because one of the things about that film, which is a film that I actually think is highly interesting. It has its problematic like elements. But I do think it's a film that like should be revisited and like and considered and talked about. When you're thinking about people like the Hughes brothers and how they're inserting themselves into cinema, this is the other problem of a lack of a kind of like political grounding. They're trying to be socially commentators, but they're not really grounded on anything. So you get someone like Tarantino, and because the way like the kind of like commodity fetishism of like expression that kind of like really happens in the 90s, he thinks he's open to everything. And to a degree, the way he's situated, I'm not saying that you can blame him, you can always blame him, but it makes sense that he would have this kind of allowance to everything because it's out there. The commodity around race, racial discourse, racial edge, identity, even talks about how movies are a way to kind of escape into a certain kind of personality and do these things. Tarantino, he ushers in a kind of belief system that all is allowable. And the real negative person is the person who tries to put guardrails on expression, right? So this idea like Spike is almost invoked like a fascist, right? Like he's almost like a fascist or some kind of authoritarian, right? Like how dare you? This is the American spirit. And I think this is one of the things that I think people don't appreciate enough about how bad Tarantino has been, is because actually what he's advocating for is a very American kind of colonial, imperial kind of attitude towards everything. Everything is up for grabs for me. And if you are blocking that, you are akin to some kind of authoritarian, anti-American spirit, right? Um, I am an example, and this is the other kind of bullshit. I think we said we want to talk about this. I am an example of a kind of like self-made greatness, right? I'm like the counterculture person. So to bar me from this means even barring yourself from greatness. So it gets really ludicrous and self-deluded. But, and I think I would leave this to scholars who have really studied the period more than I have. And I'll say this in final, is one of the things to think about is how much was it the times affecting Tarantino and how much did Tarantino affect the times? I think it's very dialectical, probably ultimately, but because what you're seeing with him does become a large attitude independent of him after a certain while. Um, and independent of movies. I mean, it goes into music, it goes into even, I think, just general social discourse around what's allowed and, this idea of people blocking, killjoys and, let people have fun and shit like that.
Everything is up for grabs. I think that's a very good point, especially if you're successful. If you're successful, you can do anything. This is like the American way. He
Yeah.
proved himself by being successful. That means he can do it. So if some I don't know if some critic uh, would have the same amount of success, he would accept that. He would accept that there's okay, if you're on my level, I can take it, but you're not. And since you're not,
Right.
prove yourself to me that you can criticize me. Um, and I also think that this allowance came from the protection by Harvey Weinstein. I think that's a very important point because we are we weren't aware of him and his power, I think. I mean, sure, since Me Too at the latest, 2015, but there were books like the book by Peter Biskind about Miramax and the American independent scene. And there you could see what he was doing. And I mean, it was already out in the open how he treated filmmakers and how he treated their films.
That's a great point. I want to button that. That's a great point, and that's one of been always been my big sticking things with Weinstein is as criminal and disgusting and as abhorrent as his sexual assault record. There was long evidence of also his abusive record towards filmmakers and his employees. Just abusive. It's really, really an all-out terrible person. And people made jokes about it at award shows. So it's like this
Yeah.
idea that, I mean, and we also don't have evidence that people also knew about his sexual assault past too. There's also that. So, but let's say there was this kind of like he was really successful at creating like an iron wall against that, right? There was all this evidence of like professional misconduct, right? Um, and yeah, not to digress, but I'll let you continue. The Weinstein point I do think is really important because he was someone who wielded a lot of power in also shaping people and also destroying people in their
Exactly.
careers.
Yeah, there are so many stories, like, the guy who directed the Studio 54 movie. He destroyed him and he didn't have a career afterwards. Or, he took away James Gray's The
Hmm.
Yards, I think, and
Yeah.
tons of stories like that. And I mean, he killed Mena Suvari, no, not Mena Suvari, Myra Sorvino's career. And that the interesting thing is that she was Tarantino's girlfriend. So
Yeah.
there's this dynamic, and I mean, it. I had to think of those, those mafia dynamics. When you're part of the family, you have to go with the family, or else.
Well, I'm gonna say something. There's an overlap in movie making, especially in the Northeast. I know some of this from personal experience. I was on a film called The Prince of Central Park when I was about 18 with Steven Seagal, and this is public record that he was a Julius Nasso was the guy, and he was part of the
Right,
Gambinos, right?
exactly, exactly.
So people know that and I met Nasso. His son was a star of the movie. So and then there's always been like the kind of like almost like Teamsters legacy that works in a lot of like New York production. I mean, I th there's like been talking about Abel Ferrara, where he got a lot of his money from, things like that, being able to kind of like funnel money. So there, Weinstein having this kind of like disposition, this kind of like gangster-esque disposition, is part of this kind of the American attitude, I think, when it comes to funding, especially funding that comes from sources that are I think that are like corralled through like multiple areas, right? Whether it's like, I actually don't know where he got his initial money from. I'm never really studied it. But if you think about things like music, right? Let's talk about like the like jazz and 60s and rock, and even in rock and roll, and where a lot of that money was coming from, right? And the stranglehold on contracts and things like that, right? And people like Weinstein, if you study that stuff and think about even movies and independent financing, the way you have to get financing and the way people need to kind of hide or like throw money into other things who are doing all types of stuff, this kind of like strong arming being a part of the culture shouldn't surprise people. It's very much baked into the kind of overall thing. And like I saw a lot of it. I started when I was an actor first. I did my first kind of films when I was like, in like the mid 90s, and you saw it was kind of like dying out. But you saw it. You saw definitely figures who have access to cash, right? And you don't quite know where it's coming from. And but then also because things are like unregulated, the abuse, right? And the manipulation that can come through it, right? And the kind of sordid characters who can really take a stranglehold over everything because there's no one to really watch over it.
Yeah, you mentioned music, and the Weinsteins, in fact, they did start out as concert promoters. So they,
Now it makes total sense because concert promoting I mean, that's gangsters
yeah.
historically, 100%. Wow.
Yeah, so that's where they started out, and films they came like slowly after that. They weren't really, they. I think the very first film they produced was, and it's a slasher film classic. It's The Burning. It's the
Oh,
film where,
yeah.
Holly Hunter is in there and Jason Alexander, which is very funny.
Hmm.
Um, and quite a good movie, but it was their first film, and and they wanted to direct, so they made this film which was also full of music. They apparently had the rights to use, so that's how that came about,
Interesting.
Yeah, yeah. So I think you can safely say that there was a certain connection between Tarantino and the Weinsteins, because those gangster stories, that he wrote, he was enamored with his stuff, and I think what he saw in the Weinsteins was they lived it, they were the personification of that, and I mean Tarantino even called Harvey a father figure. Of course, he said, fucked up father figure, but a father figure. He said that on Joe Rogan, yes. And uh, and this protection, I think it was really evident because Spike Lee was really one of the only filmmakers or filmmakers with a certain cachet and certain power that had the balls to call him out because I think everybody else just knew that he had this Miramax protection, so they didn't go there.
Yeah, I mean, and I think what you're highlighting here really speaks to the power dynamics of the independent landscape. And I think it's also relevant to talk about what independent film had become by the early to mid 90s. Because if you're thinking about independent film from like the 60s and the 70s and then the 80s it gets very weird. But think about the 60s and the 70s in the US at least. You're thinking about a situation where there is no Sundances and things like that. I think it's hard for people to remember this stuff, to think about this. Studios had a large hegemony, right? And you do have a small theater movement, right? You have these smaller places that are playing independent films, but these are like independent. They're made on their own. You also have a mix between things like softcore, right? Then you have like the politically left films, films that aren't even made by political groups, right? You have things like newsreel. You're in a very turbulent time, and sometimes all of the things would be played at one theater. You're playing like the softcore film. You're paying the third cinema lefty, film made by Marxist Leninist revolutionaries, right? It's all happening in one, and it's a big soup. And you do have things like Can, so forth and so on. But like when what they were grabbing from the U.S. was always very very conditional and small, and usually it was actually studio funded, honestly. Um, so you have this thing that like really is independent in the sense that yeah, some guys gave some money, but a lot of the stuff was made on people's like own whim, right? You get to the 80s, right? And you have like this like weird moment where there starts to be people who want to kind of put money into things for various reasons. Sometimes they're artistic. They want to help a filmmaker out. They like it. They think it's interesting. The studios are also in this kind of thing where they're supporting smaller studios. So things like, Orion start creating themselves. You have the 80s is like studying it is it's a wild period of like where some of it doesn't even make any sense. I think people were kind of like throwing, things at the wall, right? When you get into the 90s, especially with the advent of a place like Sundance, and I think this is very important, right? Because you start to develop a kind of ecosystem of like these smaller films and people like Weinstein and various other kind of smaller film producers who can't really work with Hollywood because of whatever, maybe it's not enough jobs, but but they also have connections enough to Hollywood to say, hey, if I can put something together for like $500,000, right? I can like grab a couple sources. It does well. I can maybe, make about $5-10 million with it, so like this stuff. And I think some of the successes within like the genre film stuff of making certain stuff, on your own, and then things like A Nightmare on Elm Street, right? New Line Cinema, these kind of places are starting to happen. They become kind of like things that jolt. So when you get to the 90s, though, and I saw this firsthand, one of the kind of like mythologies was that independent film was just like this wide open terrain that everybody could kind of like do all this stuff. And I saw this firsthand. I acted my first film in 1996, right? Film called Hurricane Streets. Um, and what I noticed was, and this supports your point, was a very stringent and influential system of people who were trying to please a certain kind of higher up group of individuals who had a lot of power, who were tastemakers, who had really direct access to things like a Sundance, right? Or maybe something more international. I think Toronto is another thing to kind of bring in Toronto International, because they actually showed more American films at that time, right? Meaning like in American films that didn't have a distributor already. They don't do it anymore. Um, but you you support your point. People like Weinstein, like Miramax, people were always trying to get there. They were trying to get there. And for every success in that kind of sector, you had about 15 to 20 massive failures or one hit wonders or one attempt wonders where they made one movie, didn't work, might have even got critical acclaim, but financially it was a bomb out. So if Spike Lee, who has a career, right, starts going on the train of Tarantino's a racist, no one's going to join that train because they're locked in this ecosystem that does have a power structure and an influence structure. And that's if you even disagree, even if you agree with Spike. I also would say ideologically, I don't think white filmmakers cared in the U.S. I just don't think they cared. They didn't think it was an interesting story or an interesting kind of thought stream. The black filmmaker thing is weird because in the late 80s, you had this kind of, to in the early 90s, this like black filmmaker boom, which Spike was a part of, and he was like the leading person, right? There's a famous cover photo of all these like black filmmakers, him, Matty Rich, John Singleton, da, 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 right? And if you think about that photo, Robert Townsend, a lot of those guys were not able to sustain long careers. Um, and there is a certain perception of Spike from those filmmakers as well. If you want to dig in that hole, it gets dirty. It's not a this wasn't a friends club, right? And if you get some of them have spoken publicly about their poor relationship with Spike, and some I have spoken to privately, and they'll be forthright off record, right? And
Okay.
and I say all this to say, if he's gonna start a battle with Tarantino, even if they agreed with him, they're like, man, fuck Spike. I ain't going there. But this goes back to a kind of like individualism. It's like the movies in the 90s, there were no cinematic movements. They were all if they were movements, they were largely comprised of like opportunistic moments, right? These people were not in kind of like league with each other outside of maybe a media based like designation, or honestly the general like someone put you together in like a studio and say, hey, yeah, y'all are a crew, and and they're like, I don't really even know this dude. you know
Yeah, so let's talk about the American independent scene in the 90s, or the supposed independent scene, because I mean, um, I can give Tarantino that. I mean, he came from nowhere. I mean, that's true. I mean, he had a high school diploma, and he was a video clerk, and that was all true. And I mean, he was this raconteur, and he had a certain aura around him. And even before he met Harvey Keitel and before he went to Sundance, he was kind of a cult figure. So you can't take that away from him. He did it by himself, and yeah. But what happened there exactly? I mean, of course, he was how's this character called from the Bud Schoolberg novel, Sammy Glick or something? Uh,
yeah, I think that's what it's called. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this guy, this hustler, and he
Yeah.
had this hustler mentality, and I mean, he would go to these directors. He would say, "I'm writing a book about you," but he never did, just to get them to talk to him, and he would say he was, I mean, he would invent actors' credits for himself. Like he was one of the bikers in George Romero's Knight Riders,
Yeah.
or he was a zombie in Day of the Dead, I don't know. And but he was in a Golden Girls episode as an Elvis impersonator. So so this
Yeah.
is so he was hustling, and he was doing his thing, and I guess he was lucky that Harvey Keitel liked him, and he liked his script, and he got him to Sundance, to work on it. And the rest is history, as you speak. But of course, this is a very unique story because, as you said, most of those stories they went totally differently, and not as successfully. And yeah, there's a lot of backstabbing. And I've read this interesting book about the making of Natural Born Killers that you talked about in the beginning, by the
Mm-hmm.
producer Jane Hampshire. And because she was a first-time producer, she and her producing partner, whose name I forgot, and they were kind of thrown into this film scene and into the independent scene, and all of a sudden they had this script which was hot and was by Tarantino, obviously, and then Oliver Stone was interested in it, and it all exploded. And I was reading about all the stories about Tarantino, how he abandoned all of his friends, from from the past, and they all wanted to work together and support each other. And obviously, he's still friends with Roger Avery, but
Hmm.
there were a lot of other guys, and they were kind of a group. But as soon as he became a name, as soon as he became somebody, they were gone. So and it was very interesting. And I mean, there was this other story about Robert Rodriguez, which he's also kind of a self-made man. I think he's different from Tarantino in that regard, that he's kind of a technical guy or a technical genius, because he was always interested in the technical side of things and how to
Yeah,
do.
yeah. His book Rebel Without a Crew, I think, had a big um sent like purchase around filmmakers in the late 90s, maybe even the mid. I can't remember when the book actually came out, but no, I agree with you. And not to cut you off, I would like you to continue. But yeah, Rodriguez was. It's funny because it quickly died. I mean, once he did the studio film for Desperado, and I think things changed, especially as you went into digital. I think his legend kind of like dissipated really, really quickly.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, he's obviously very talented, but
Hmm.
he's not really an auteur for me. He's not interesting enough. His films are just not interesting enough. And but the point I was making is that people are still talking about El Mariachi, and
Yes.
and I think, I mean, it's an inspiring story, but you don't have to forget that. Sure, he made it for $7,000, but then was it Miramax? They bought it, and then they had to put like 100,000, or I don't know, maybe 50, 60,000 dollars in it for additional post
Yeah, it
production.
was a good amount of money. I remember hearing about that. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a lot of money, and I mean,
Yeah.
the same thing happened afterwards with the Blair Witch Project. This was
Yes.
very expensive, and the same thing happened with Paranormal Activity. You know,
Hmm.
everybody's talking about, hey, this was just 10,000. Yeah, but after that, Spielberg became interested, and then boom, it's no longer a no budget film. I'm sorry. And or the same with Sean Baker's Takeout. That was the
Oh yeah.
same thing. So, um, I mean, I love those inspiring stories, but at the same time, if the film doesn't get picked up, you nothing will happen to it. Nothing will happen with it, you know?
Yeah, and I think it's important to think about like what are like the tastes and attitudes of those periods. Like we're thinking about Tarantino's rise, right? If you think about the world at that moment, right? Tarantino also comes at a particular time where the 80s was like this big fight between a really kind of conservative orientation towards the world that was very wildly popular. If you're thinking about Stallone, Schwarzenegger,
Top
right?
Gun.
Top Gun, right? The Cannon films. And then you had, I would say, a kind of not I don't want to say pseudo counter hegemonic with people like Carpenter, but a kind of like social critique that's like masked in a kind of genre way that audiences would like both. Like I know a lot of people who would watch, Christine and love it, and then also watch Rambo First Blood Part 2 and love that also. And it becomes this way that like film really becomes, I think in the 80s, a kind of like thing that you're like sampling different kind of attitudes. And I think this becomes important for Tarantino because then once the kind of political landscape changes globally, right? You Soviet Union fall, so there's no longer an interest in making movies like that, right? These kinds of, no more Rocky Fours are going to be made, right? things like that. So that falls, um, Berlin Wall, that big change like socially and how that kind of affects people's, I think, mind. The kind of American horizon, I just think kind of takes over. So the American horizon is also this kind of like, let's sample everything. Everything is kind of go back to the up for grabs thing. And what I think Tarantino taps into is this zest to really fixate on what are the most, I don't want to say just base, but what are the most like kind of like attitudinally ruckusy cool things that Americans want to get into, and who's just gonna do it, right? And who's gonna put some like veneer over it and give it some kind of vibe, right? And he taps into that. And I think those studio people really liked that, right? They thought it was going to be good for them. They were correct, right? It made a lot of money, so they wanted to keep doing it. So he becomes the kind of thought leader, and a kind of person that I think everyone follows. But I think we really have to appreciate just that the chaos of the American kind of psyche in the 90s, because at that point, America is so hegemonically powerful in terms of like cultural messaging. You're in Clinton, right, when he's really getting his vibe going. And one of the things about the Clinton presidency that I think is really interesting in the US is that it was a presidency kind of marred and classified by like Clinton's own kind of like, he plays the saxophone. Is he sleeping with his staff members? White water, like all this kind of America. It feels kind of gangsterish in this kind of way, in a different way. And like I didn't feel that before. Reagan and Bush one is very like, it's kind of like neocon kind of like, hard attitude. And now we're kind of in this like loosey goosey kind of funky era. So, and the 90s is just we all want to kind of like cultural commodity fetish, like revel, to be able to revel in it. And I just think he taps into that. So when you bring in people like Baker, Blair Witch, they're all heirs to that. It's funny. I had dinner a while ago with one of Sean Baker's early producers, and I can't stand Sean Baker. I think Sean Baker is awful. And I think I've never liked any of his work. I just can't stand it. I don't like him either. In interviews, he's terrible. But one of the things that I realized when I met one of his older producers from his really early films is that this is kind of what people are looking for. They're looking for a kind of post Tarantino, someone who has like an idea that is like sellable to a kind of market that's like really likes salacious or like somewhat of like quote unquote edgy dynamics in their movies. Someone who's willing to kind of do things that will probably piss off a section of the country, right? Whether it's race, class, sex, gender, whatever, you know, do that. I think about that with like Tangerine, right? And him making that film. They want those kinds of people, and that's what the producer said to me about Sean. They were like, and they love him. They were like, yeah, he was just willing to. He's just a great idea person. We just trust that when he walks in the room, he's gonna have that idea that's gonna blow it out, and it might even be a little scary, but that's why Sean's gonna be successful. And it's funky, and they wonder why people like Harvey Weinstein existed in Hollywood.
You know, Sean Baker for me he's like an authenticity vampire. He
Yes,
would
good
look
line.
he would look for this authenticity and he would milk it
Hmm.
until it dies. And I mean he perfected it. I mean if you look at Takeout, I mean yes, it all feels real and it looks real and I mean there was a lot of preparation. but it's like a facsimile. It's it he's very much interested in rebuilding. He wants to experience those worlds that he is not part of. So in a way, he's exploitative, in my opinion, because he's like a middle class guy. And I was always wondering, so I mean, why is he interested in these subcultures? Where also these subcultures where people get exploited, like the Chinese immigrants or like the porn people or what have you. I mean, he goes exact, or the poor people in Florida Project and so on. And it's all, and critics love that because they always go for the humanity and so on. But it's I
Blah.
don't buy it. I
Well,
like
no,
it.
yeah. So what you're touching on, and I have to fight this in as a film professor. And I think some of this actually can be traced back to things like investigative reporting in the 60s and the 70s, Iowa Writers Workshop. This idea that the storyteller's job is to kind of go in and use their power and their privilege to kind of do the expose of the kind of individual who is not represented enough or represented in a way that's not quantifiably in a good way in line with like liberal democratic views, right? So like you think about that of like the Florida Project, the idea of like the kind of like, slum kids and things like that, and Baker sees an opportunity with something like that to take that, fit it within the expectations of the kind of humanitarian projects that are very, 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 have a lot of purchase with a kind of like certain like liberal moviegoer. Um, but also like give them a permission to kind of revel in the kind of cliche, often made up edges about, these kids curse or, are overly sexualized and they do these things and you can kind of like revel in it. I mean, he isn't the only one. I mean, even films like City of God from that came out of Brazil, I think fit into this paradigm, right? And but this is largely seen as the filmmaker's job. So I could imagine someone like Sean Baker, maybe early in his career, whatever he was pitching, someone told him, was like, nah, man, you got to go up there and you got to find that story. You got to find that thing that no one else has access to, right? And you got to bring it. Like I teach my students. They watched Burden of Dreams, the documentary about Werner Herzog's Fitzcarraldo. I show them that. The reason why I show them that doc, and I don't think that doc is even perfect in itself, but what it does is pretty much show Herzog's really poor approach to making that film and his very kind of Western imperialist, chauvinist, colonial attitude, right? But what Herzog consistently shows is he thinks he's actually doing something beneficial for the representational story of the indigenous of that land. He thinks he's actually doing a real study of the psyche of the European, which is crazy because he doesn't even realize he's actually living out that same psyche himself. It's kind of boggling to see someone so fucking tone deaf. Um, but and it's funny because Herzog, I think by that point, by the 90s, also was someone who was very popular to American filmmakers. He was seen as like, I want to be like her Herzog in the US. So this kind of idea of like finding the place, going into the terrain, it's like bad investigative reporting tales, like war reporters and this shit. And I think it really has taken over the American filmmaker, and not just America, probably in Europe as well. Um, that you got to find that story, that group or that person to represent, like, and then you can see it in the 90s, even with the dramas, like things like Dead Man Walking, shit like that, or Boys Don't Cry. I think that's the aughts, but yeah, it continues this kind of like advocacy stories, but how they're kind of like funneled into a very narrow liberal advocacy kind of narrative that often even fucks up the stories or like doesn't tell the stories correctly or misrepresents the people. I mean, they end up becoming really bad. People hate the movie when it comes out, and it becomes this. I think of like The Blind Side that won Sandra Bullock the Oscar, right? The dude that the movie's supposed to be based on, he can't stand that movie because it makes him look like he's an idiot. He's like, this white woman didn't make my whole life. He's like, what are you talking about, right? But this is like this. So this is largely how the filmmaker is thought to be positioned in society. They are this advocate, right? And they know better than the people who live in those areas.
I couldn't agree more on Herzog. I will do a podcast on him eventually because there's a lot to unpack, especially with Fitzcarraldo and also with films like Lessons of Darkness, which for me
Hmm.
is like it's like total exploitation, of the Kuwaiti people.
I agree.
It's really insane, and but he's got such a good standing, in Germany and in the US. I guess the Germans, they love the fact that there's uh, one German director who's even from the days of Oberhausen, one of those guys, the intellectual guys who was able to make it in the US, in Hollywood even. And so maybe that's why they still. I mean, I'm not for canceling or something like that. I'm not that type of person, but it's truly baffling that he hadn't been canceled because he was doing insane stuff. And the story about Fitzgerald, and nobody talks about this. He wasn't with the Machigangas at first. He was with a totally different tribe.
Yeah.
And he got the fucking local government, to shoot at those people because they wouldn't comply, because they wouldn't do what he and his production guy Walter Sachser told them to. And nobody here in Germany would talk about this. No, nobody would. And it it's not that well documented, I have to admit. You have to dig a little to find that stuff. But again,
Yeah.
you can find it.
Yeah, and it's funny because I asked someone who knew Les Blank,
Mhm.
who did Burden of Dreams. I said, Les knew about some of that stuff, didn't he? Right? And he says, yeah. He said he protected him a little bit. I was like, hmm. I said, I figured because I was like, he couldn't have been that connected to the production and some of these other finer point things. He did not know. So leave it at that.
Yeah. Yeah, but back to Tarantino. Yeah, we were talking about the independent scene, and compared to people like Sean Baker, I um I kind of prefer Tarantino because he's so openly exploitative. He admits to it, and his world is, it's like a made up world. So it's I can. It's not like I agree, but I get where he's coming from, and I like his influences as well. I also I love those canon films that I politically don't endorse. They're a lot of fun. I like the blaxploitation films from back in the day. I like I like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and things like that. And I like Sergio Leone and other Italian westerns. So I get where he's coming from. And I always appreciated the fact that he highlighted those influences. And I thought that was cool. So I like that. And I also like the fact that he, at least in the 90s, he was talking about Asian cinema. He was talking about John Woo. He was talking about Takeshi Kitano, and he was talking about Wong Kar-wai. And he would also talk about Eric Romer. So there was a kind of internationalism that he evoked, but I mean, he didn't really fulfill the promise. And I mean, if you look at recent, his 10 years best lists, they're atrocious and they're terrible. But in the 90s, there was, I mean, there was a glimmer of hope because you thought, wow, this is someone who was open to cinema. But I think, the door kind of closed. And, especially, after, the Clinton years ended and George Bush became president, and Tarantino had the urge to go all the way with the violence, and to acknowledge his influences from Hong Kong cinema, Asian cinema, but at the same time, I don't know, kind of trump it.
Yeah, I mean, this gets very interesting. And I'm gonna say some things that I think definitely what I'm saying is in the hindsight of just getting older. If we think about Hong Kong cinema and then also Japanese cinema, and I actually am a big Kitano fan. I quite like his films. I think he's made some special works. Um, but one of the things to kind of situate in the kind of political landscape of those films is that they both come out of very kind of conservative governments and eras, right? Within Japan and Hong Kong. I mean, Hong Kong is pretty conservative, just general. In Japan, we can talk about that, the waverings of their kind of right wing kind of political form. What's interesting about Katano, in my opinion, it's always been my read of him, is he's one of these filmmakers who kind of wants to do a read of Japan and its warts and really shows that, this kind of disposition that the Japanese have is fundamentally a murderous one to its own societal development. It does not have a possibility. I mean, think about Sonatine and the end of Violent Cop. I mean, this is just I mean, gosh, there's no way you can watch those films and see a kind of possibility. And then the funny thing about Tarantino is what he can only excavate from that is the kind of violence. He can't excavate the real social critique because Tarantino has no real read of America materially. He has no understanding. Wu is interesting because I think Wu is a filmmaker who was really dazzled by the kind of like he's more similar to Tarantino in this kind of way, like violence as this like large spectacle that you could just right. I think Johnny Toe is more interesting in terms of thinking about kind of Hong Kong and things like that and how that kind of situates itself politically. I'm not saying he's a political filmmaker, but he's a smarter guy in that kind of way. Um, so I think Tarantino kind of championing that stuff also kind of fell in line with, I think, a kind of like nihilism that he wanted to kind of popularize into a kind of like, into a kind of like jacket that you could kind of wear and just be like pop nihilism. Yeah. And then you get into Kill Bill and we get into Inglourious Basterds, which has like its own, like revisionist, him doing revisionist films and things like that. Um, I think it situates a kind of him being a tastemaker for nihilism to be a really powerful, um, I think, effect on movies generally. especially independent movies, right? And movies made by men, right? And kind of like male. Yes, I know he's into Wong Kar-wai as well, and he championed him. I also often feel like a lot of that stuff was him trying to corner market, have the market kind of go through him a little bit. Because remember when he was like putting his name on stuff, Quentin
Yeah.
Tarantino presents. So there you go. He's making himself like the distributor, and he's not really doing anything. So it's like it was also a good money move for him. But I think it's really important to situate global cinema in the 90s going into the aughts as a place where I think a general nihilism, a celebration of a certain kind of nihilistic perspective, a kind of like defeated perspective. And I even say this about films that I quite like. I'm not saying going the cancel thing. Like I'm not saying we gotta wash it away. I think it's interesting, and this is what Tarantino, as a critic, because I know he's tried to be a critic as well. What he can't provide is an understanding of like the societal reasons why these movies came out on these periods. Like I was rewatching Tokyo Fist, right? And I absolutely love that movie. I think that movie is like absolutely like stellar, right? And uh, Tsukamoto is a filmmaker that I think has done some really, really incredible stuff. But there's no way you can like really understand their movies and understand about like mid 90s Japan and the kind of like nihilism that was developing out of like of where their culture was, right? And like if you just and if you watch those films and you don't do a kind of like conjunctural read of that also, you can kind of like go into some dangerously dark places, I think, as an individual. Right. And I probably did when I was watching a lot of these movies when I was like 19, 20, 21, right? Without the context. But then when I think about the context of these things, and then I watch a violent cop or I watch a sonatine by Kitano, I go, oh, interesting. Oh, this is interesting thinking about society and how the society was situated at that time, right? But we don't have that. We don't have these kind of analyses readily available, and I think it ends up making a kind of soup of things where this way to approach stories becomes what film should be, right? Not rather, this is what film was in this period because of whatever social shit was happening in globally or this country or this moment or amongst men or amongst women or amongst this political movement, so forth and so on. Those types of analyses don't really exist.
Right. And I think what distinguishes Tarantino's films from those kinds of films. I mean, apart from the things that you said, is the self-consciousness of it all, because he knows what he's doing, he knows what he's quoting and what for. And I think there's a difference when you if you have a John Waters and you have Divine eats shit in Pink Flamingos, it's very different than Stifler eating shit in American Pie. It's not the same kind of thing. One thing is like a subversive act. The other is gross out humor in a very much capitalist environment, and it's sanctioned. So, and the same thing goes for Tarantino and his exploitative approach. So, when he cuts people off in Kill Bill, it's not the same as um, it's not the same like Lady Snowblood or Tsukamoto doing th things like that. It's not the same thing. He's he's like. I mean, it's not only self-consciousness, but it's also, the self-awareness that he's doing this from a point, from a position of power. He knows he can do this and he can get away with it, and there'll be no problems. There is no risk in that kind of sense. There's an economic risk like with all movies, but this is like this is like it's a very safe thing to do in a way.
Yes, And I probably will take it a step further in saying that because he has this power that you've identified and he has this kind of sense of himself, Tarantino was also very much interested in setting the mark on what the discourse could be, right? Because if you listen to Tarantino talk about political filmmakers, he's very dismissive, extremely dismissive. Um, and he wants to set a mark where a certain orientation towards how we look at the products of cinema and cinema as a product should how we should orient ourselves, and we should see it as a thing that kind of what I think you can pick apart, grab what you think is cool and make a kind of collage work, right? And I think that's the other thing he also popularizes is the idea that film should be a collage of influences, right? And I think he muddies homages, but also like the idea that things build upon itself. So if you know if when the passenger was made and they do that steady cam shot, right? Or the steady cam that they made up, and Antonioni. And that influences a certain kind of thing. It's not a copy of what Antonioni did. It's a new technique, and people are like building upon it, right? Right, and it has a similarity, and but Antonio did this, but let's like add this little thing to it, right? Rather than Tarantino, he treats movies like they're things to take as pieces. I don't want to say thievery as much as I want to say it's like a grab bag because everything is really ideas to him. They're not he wants to create an experience through ideas. So like I'm gonna take your like little pieces of your thing and like make this like new kind of like experience that you can like we can all revel in. And it's just the idea. There's nothing material to it. There's nothing that undergirds it other than really his want to find a way also, and this is the other thing, and I think this really kicks off with Kill Bill. I don't think Pulp Fiction and Reservoir Dogs and Jackie Brown he really cared about this, but I think the thing about Kill Bill is he wants people to get on his side for things that maybe on the everyday they actually wouldn't agree with. Right? I think that's like the big thing with Inglorious Bastards. I remember when I went and saw it years ago. And I was really down on him. And a homie of mine said, "You got to go see this movie." I was like, "Why?" He says, "You're gonna hate it." But he told me, "But I need you to watch it because he hated it, but he wanted to talk to me about it." I was like, "Yeah, yeah, okay, fuck it, I'll go." And I'm watching it, and for the most part, I was bored. Right? I was bored by the movie, right? And I'm watching it, and I'm like, okay, all right, the violence, and then like the kind of Jewish hunters. I was like, oh, okay, he's doing this thing interesting, right? Okay, well, I guess they're gonna get killed because they're Jewish and the Nazis, da 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 da. And then when they get to the theater sequence, you you watch the revision of the murder. I said, "Oh, so this is what he's doing now in his career. He's basically doing the how can I get people to celebrate the most large violent spectacle in history? Give Jews the opportunity to murder Hitler, right? Like, yeah." And I was watching the film. I remember sitting in the theater just like I think my jaw was just open. And I was like, wow, this is pretty incredible that he because I saw the people were really into it, and I left the movie theater, and people were like just so into it, and I called that friend. I don't know if I was immediately, but I ended up calling that friend or like letting him know, and he was like, "You saw it, right?" He said, "Did that shit piss you off?" I said, "Yeah." I was astonished, and I realized that what he wants to do, and it's a grand manipulation. He has a certain conceit. He has a desired kind of wants to get an audience to kind of buy into a thing that he wants to make normal within society. And he constructs a kind of long, manipulative way to do it, right? And through that one, it was clearly who was the group that will never defend? Right? Right? And
Exactly.
I won't defend him either. I won't defend him either. But like, but like, boom, let's murder them all, including the grand one that you didn't get a chance to murder because he killed himself in a bunker. And I'm like, wow, that's that's sweet. That's very sweet, Quentin. Good job.
No, it's so funny that okay, he changes history. So he doesn't prevent the Holocaust, but but he kills Hitler. Okay.
Right, right. And it's like, and it's weird because it also has to. I think it's the West. I was going to say America, but I will actually put this on the West. But no, maybe I could separate America from it. It's how Americans deal with history. Like one of like the big like thoughts about Back to the Future, right? They always say is that in changing the 50s for the McFlys, you probably also erase the turbulent 60s and the 70s, right?
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
So it's like for Tarantino, in this murdering Hitler, right, and the Nazis, right? Yeah, it's either that the Holocaust doesn't happen, or if it happens, oh well, it's just another footnote. Y'all still got to kill Hitler, so that's better, right? It doesn't really have any kind of material relation actually with history. And it does what American films have always done with Nazis. Because the thing is, the other thing I'll say about this, and I can leave it is, or I can leave it as a you and I have to leave it. But one of the things is what he's doing with Nazis is actually not that original. Also, how he situates them in the American film, it's largely been a trope. And to me, I said to someone when it came out, I said, this actually exposes how traditional a filmmaker Tarantino is actually, by him having to go to Nazis to kind of do his long manipulative game, right? That is honestly the most typical, right? Cliche. Nazis, bro. And then he does the slaves after that with Django, right? Like, oh wow, dude. How original.
Yeah, so let's talk about the historical revisionism in his work for a bit, because Um, Inglourious Basterds is a very interesting movie to me. I mean, first thing I have to say, it was a traumatic experience for me seeing that in the theater because my no, not it's not what you think. It's my
Hmm.
girlfriend at the time broke up with me, but I was yeah already had a date with a couple of friends, with my with some guys
Uh-huh.
and I was shattered, and then I had to see this movie. I will always
Of just
remember that.
total violence.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Total violence. And but the weirdest thing is how the German critics reacted. And I just have to address it because nobody talks about this. It's like I don't know. It's sometimes it's a bit like living in the Twilight Zone here because
Hmm.
people don't talk about things like that, and especially because I wasn't born in Germany. I was born in the former Soviet Union, so I never had this relationship, with the German past, like the ordinary Germans. So
Yeah.
I had this other perspective. So,
Interesting.
yeah, and I never felt guilty or anything, because why? Why should I feel guilty? I was born in the former Soviet Union, and we had relatives who died during the war back in the day.
Right.
So, and but but at the same time, I was like, I was always a bit laid back about the subject because I thought, what's with all the guilt, people, you know what I mean? And but this is something. It's funny, Sandra Hüller. She was in Cannes in a film, in the new film by Pavel Pawlikowski, who made a film
Oh,
about
really?
Thomas Mann, and somebody asked her about Germany and about guilt, and she said, "Yeah, I feel guilty every day, and I never get bored of it," and it was such a German answer. It's incredible. But what I wanted to do is read this excerpt from a from a famous German critic, Georg Seeslin. He wrote, "The genius of Inglourious Bastards is that it has the audacity to ignore history. The audacity to ignore history. In some cases," he argues, "pure cinematic fantasy can do a better job of getting to the truth than historical authenticity. Fiction trumps reality." So, um,
Trumps.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
This is insane. This is insane. Here's another one. I just have to read it, but I won't say the critic's name because he will go after me. So,
Interesting.
Inglorious Bastards finally does to the Nazis what they have always deserved, ushering in a new and better era of historical cinema. This film will shape our image of the Second World War and Germans' image of themselves for years to come. Here, cult director Quentin Tarantino delivers a deeply personal and remarkably bold version of the Second World War. That was all written in 2007 when the film came out.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And just if you just think of today and Tarantino's association with the IDF and him living in Israel and
Hmm.
I mean this is so insane. But the Germans they wouldn't go there.
No, no. And it's funny. I'm glad you shared that with me because I actually never did do a study of that, and I never thought about it. Though years ago, a friend of mine's ex-wife is from Germany. She's from Berlin, and lovely person. And I remember we were like at dinner once, and we were talking about like our upbringings, right? And I think it was her grandfather was an SS. I think something like that, right? And and we were talking about it and like, all that type of stuff, and she said, her shame with that. But she admitted to me another kind of thing. She's like, I feel uncomfortable saying this. I was like, no, say it. She's like, but in school they always wanted to make me like feel like nationally guilty, that like I was, I did this and like I hate my grandfather and I hate Nazis and I think what they did was terrible. But then like there was the way that they talked about history is like this like national shame and when I would ask questions about why it would happen, they were never really like they had no kind of analysis. And she always found herself very frustrated. So when she was 18, she left Germany. She was like went to college. I maybe in the States. I'm like misremembering. She eventually came to the States. And I think still lives here. And that conversation always kind of stuck with me because it was interesting to see someone with really good politics really frustrated because the way that people wanted to kind of engage um in history with her is this kind of like metaphysical um terrain. And this is a person it's not because she has like some secret like energy of like I really like Nazis. Like she was like no, they're disgusting and like all this is disgusting. My grandfather was a disgusting person, but like like why can't like someone have a real conversation with me? So those reviews prove her point, right? It proves her point that no one wants to have an actual real conversation with her about why these things happen. I always think about a movie like Cabaret, which I think is not a great movie for this reason because while they do kind of show things about Weimar that are interesting and the kind of stuff like that, they like the Nazis are like this like metaphysical like the end shot you just see like the Nazis and like in like the audience the demons are coming and I'm just like okay it's like very unsatisfying especially As you get older, you read, you study, right? And you learn things and you realize things happen because of a historical process. Fascism and all these things happen out of a historical process, right? Same thing with the genocide in Gaza, a historical process tied to Europeanism and all types and all these really horrible shit that, we talk about in the political world. So when I think about Inglorious Bastards and Django, they become these elixirs to not deal with the kind of social understanding of history in a material way. And what that does is when you make everything metaphysical, you're able to honestly dodge your own personal kind of positioning within things. And this is why, I'm sure Tarantino, with, really genocidal loving Eli Roth in his film, they can sit there, feel like in doing this movie, they're doing some kind of service, but then also not have any kind of humanity for Palestinians, right? Because they like historical revision. They think kind of like my version of history or this kind of like weirdly new shaped version of history is something that's worthy. I'll go to Django real quick because Django then gets very interesting because then that movie, and I always make this joke, is it came out on Christmas here in the States. And my mother, who every now and then does this, she'll go, Tume, let's go see this new Jamie Foxx movie. I said, Mom, you're not gonna like that. She's like, No, what do you mean? Stop it. You be trying to tell me what I'm gonna like. I said, Mom, I know you're not going to like it, but he's like a black cowboy. I said, Okay, Mom, fine. I'm not gonna argue with you. Let's go. So we go on Christmas Day to watch Django. Long story short, and I'll get into the other pieces, she hated it. She couldn't stand it. She was offended. In the movie, she's like, oh my God. And I was like, Mom, you should have listened to me. The Django thing, when I watched it, this to me exposed Tarantino's real paternalistic um, attitude towards black people. And I think it made me then realize he has the same thing with Jewish people as well. That he saw his white self as the person who was going to give deliverance to these oppressed folks, blacks and Jews. He's going to do on screen the thing that they were ever never able to do in actual history. Jews weren't able to kill Hitler, man. So what if I give them 2.5 hours where they get to kill him? Black people weren't able to blow up plantations. What if I give them 2.5 hours where they're able to do it? I mean, it's diabolically fucking wicked. And so when I remember seeing Jago leaving it and like Inglorious Bastards goes back into my head and I go, oh my God. And this is what I said, this man is actually historically evil, right? But the thing, and I'll say this last thing, the thing that fucked me up is similar to what you just read in the German critics. We're seeing black critics celebrate and say thank you for this experience where we're able to kind of have a black man ride out on a horse and I think this has long-term effects. I think I'm gonna say it. I think even the movie like Get Out and the ending that I don't and the ending that I don't like about Get Out. I don't like Get Out's conclusion. I don't think the movie ultimately either, but the way it kind of goes into its conclusion, I think largely has to this idea that like people need to see wins on screen. I'll button it with this. I had a conversation at a festival with someone once. She said, "What do you think of Get Out?" I said, "I don't like Get Out." She was like, "Why?" I said, "The ending." Da, da, da. She said, "Well, black people need wins. We need to watch a win." And I said to her, I was like, "Well, do you like Django?" She said, "Yeah, we win." I said, "Okay, thank you."
Yeah, yeah, I know what you mean. Um, it's also interesting that, Django Unchained. I mean, it's the same type of, historical revisionism and torture and gore, but it's in the Obama era this time, so it's like woke torture and gore. So because if the black slave, if he fights back and he does the same thing to the whites, that's cool. It's like, cowboys and Indians. Now we get to kill you. And the same strategy applies to Inglorious Bastards. We the Jews, now we get to kill you, the Germans. And yeah, and of course, this has nothing to do with history or how history operates or with uh, I mean, this is so dangerously childish, and I get what you mean when you say it's truly evil, and I think so, and I think the most evil part is that people respond to it, and I don't think that people realize what they're responding to. Maybe they don't even think about it, and they just see it as entertainment, which is a problem in itself. But I can't. I mean. I mean, it's what it is. I can't judge that. But but it's. I do think that it's a disservice to history and to historical nuance because look at what Paul Verhoeven did with Black Book. All of
Hmm.
a sudden, they are the good Nazis. So what do you do with those? And they are the
Right.
bad resistance guys. What do you do with those? So this is an uncomfortable movie. But it
Yeah.
has a lesson, and it is entertaining and all that, but there's a lesson in there. But you don't have those with
Yeah.
Tarantino.
Well, Verhoeven, and he's not perfect, but I'll say this about Verhoeven. He's at least thinking,
Yeah, for sure.
at the very least. And I think I like a lot of Paul Verhoeven's work. And I think he's a very, very interesting, fascinating filmmaker. And there's some really he should be studied. But he's thinking. He's literally having a process of thought with history and how things go, right? Tarantino's not thinking in that way. He's well looking at here's what he's trying to do because I think the other person to kind of thing is bringing someone like Brecht, right? This is what Brecht forewarned, right? Brecht said that, you know, the theater can be a really, really powerful pacification tool. Because this is the thing you got to think about. If Jewish folks and black folks watch those two movies, right? Right. And they do what those articles say that it gives them the release or what Tarantino wants them to do. It gives them the release or the kind of closure that they've been looking for, right? Then thus the book is closed on violence in history, right? Or if the book isn't closed, you just make another movie in that style. And that's how you close the book. You don't change the material world. You don't change the social relations, right? Right? You don't do any of that. And I think where it gets really screwed up is if you think about Inglorious Bastards, the Zionists involved with that film. So history is now closed for them. So anything that they do now is not attached to that history. And if anything, you can rewrite the history you want. And the black people in America, I'm going to say this very, very pointedly, who like Django, and I'm talking about the black people who benefit from Django, are the black bourgeoisie. It works for the black bourgeoisie, right? Because what happens is people like Jamie Foxx, Kerry Washington, they're able to kind of like slum and be slaves who like liberate and they become symbols, right? So then one of the things that I always say is, to bring my mom back in. And I said it already. She said the new Jamie Foxx movie. Whenever my mother wants to go see a Denzel Washington movie, she doesn't say the title. She says, I want to see the new Denzel. So these people become totems of freedom. So this is the problem with first cinema and second cinema is that you get into this disposition where the movie theater does the kind of political act for you. It does the transforming for you. You don't have to be active in the real world. And that's the Brechtian critique, right? Right? You're not motivated to do anything. You're actually pacified, right, in the theater. And he's a pacifier in that kind of way. And Tarantino knows that and he thinks it's good. He thinks it's good. He thinks it's what you're supposed to do as a filmmaker, right? And there we have it.
He thinks it's cathartic, probably,
Right.
you know?
Which is like, but then like Brecht said catharsis is actually dangerous, right? Or people like Augusto Boal, right? He said, we don't fuck with this catharsis stuff. Catharsis is actually a problem, right? Brecht's whole thing was you actually can't eliminate catharsis, you have to regulate it. You have because it's impossible. You can't completely do it. Identification is part of it and the kind of being getting drunk in it, but you have to see where you're hitting that point with the audience, pull back and then make them an observer where they can, intellectually judge and then take the information they have and then have the cathartic experience of revolution in their own life.
Right, right. It's also funny that no, two things. One thing is that 1 year before Django, I think Zero Dark 30 came out, and that was another like I call it a woke torture film, because it's a woman who's leading the team, Jessica Chastain, and you remember Michelle Obama, at the Oscars, and all this kind of stuff. Um, and this is, I think this is kind of this is this is the legacy of Obama. It's like torture with a human face, with a cool face. With the guy who can sing "Sweet Home Chicago." This kind of this kind of thing. I always found it interesting. There were photos of the Russian president Putin on a horse, and everybody, and yeah, it's funny. I admit it's funny, and everybody was making fun of it. But then I thought to myself, okay, but Obama, he's singing "Sweet Home Chicago" as if he's. This is also LARPing. They both do the same thing.
100%.
Yeah, but but
100%.
but when he's doing it, that's cool. When Putin's doing it, that's like a relic from another time, and it's cringy. And but they're both doing the same thing. And I mean, he escalated the drone wars, and I mean Obama, and he put this kind of human face on torture, and you can see that in Zero Dark 30, and you can see that in Django Unchained. So that's very interesting to me
I mean,
that,
Bigelow, and then I'm going to throw Bigelow in there. Bigelow, though, even from Blue Steel.
yeah,
I mean, Bigelow, this is a legacy of her career, and I think if you kind of do like a kind of like mirror, kind of like side, I actually think it's helpful to kind of do a Tarantino Bigelow like side by side kind of like excavation because she's different, but she provides a similar kind of catharsis, to be honest with you, through her use of identity even when she doesn't have women in her films, the fact that she is a woman director, she does violence, right? And all those types of things. And then, but always has a disposition that is very pro-military, very pro-imperialist. But like they say, it's the imperialism with like the rainbows.
yeah, exactly. That's probably a good way, to segue into the whole N-word controversy, because it kind of, it exploded with Django Unchained, I think, because I mean, it was insane. And it's funny. Tarantino can change history. He can change it around, but he has to have that word. You know, he can't live without it, and it's very interesting to me. And the thing is, you know when Randy Newman did it in a song, about rednecks, he did he said it once, and it's cool. It's a song about these types of people, about racists, and it's like it's a coherent thing, but you didn't say it 60 times. And yeah, and so, and to make the free speech argument there is, I think it's kind of lazy. And if freedom of speech for you boils down, to racial slurs and to violence, I don't think this is really about freedom of speech. You know what I mean?
Yes, and I'm gonna agree with you, but I'm gonna like say it a little differently. I think it actually shows what freedom of speech really does mean to them. And I think it goes back to this idea of allowance. They think freedom of speech is a kind of social allowance to express oneself the way they see fit based on really power. The first part, I think Tarantino will acknowledge. I think he would acknowledge it. The second part, the power part, I think he probably admits it like in his bed at night, right? Or maybe with his friends after with a couple of drinks, when he's really feeling saucy. Because this goes into but I think this goes into like liberal democracy, right? Because like look, the people who have power, people with private property ownership, influence based on capital or relationship to capital, right? Tarantino has a high relationship to capital even before he had his own fortunes, right? He was able to situate himself next to people like Lawrence Bender and the Weinsteins, and then later studios and so forth and so on. So as he's accumulating his own kind of empire of capital, he's already situated with them. So this whole thing with the N-word has to do with, look, it's kind of what you said earlier, right? I got the power. I've made it. I'm successful. Liberal democracy actually mandates that I have a greater level of freedom than any other body else, right? And he wants to express it. This is where he is the most American director in that kind of way. He's like, it is my right based on success, right? Within the social relations of this nation. And for you to deny me it makes you an un-American. It makes you unliberal. It makes you unenlightened. It makes you da, 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 da. Let's just keep going on and on and on, right? And then I think it's situated in like in a couple of different ways, because I think we go back to Django. One of the things that I had noticed is I watched a few interviews with years ago, and what I noticed about Tarantino when he would get flustered when people would question if the film was racist and if he was racist also because of like the password. He definitely went into this fucking thing about like, look, I done given you a movie where you get to kill white people. How dare you, like, question me? And it goes to that kind of like really insidious paternalism that he has. I mean, he's like the liberal slave master, quote unquote, right? He's like the good slave master, right? Like, hey, I know you're on my plantation, but I'll let you whip the guy and the white serf that I have, yeah, I mean, it's literally what it is. I mean, and even if you think of how Django operates as a film, like when you interact with it, right, it feels that way, right? Because I think what's his name, the actor who was also in Inglourious Basterds, who plays the German, I forget his name, who plays the
Uh,
German,
to Schweiger, or you mean Christoph Waltz?
Christoph Waltz.
Ah, the Austrian
Yeah.
actor, yes.
The Austrian, I'm sorry, he's Austrian, right? Thank you. The Austrian actor, right? Even through Christoph Waltz being in Django, you see this idea that like he's like his teacher, right? This the
It's a white
paternalism.
savior movie.
Yeah, 100%. He's like, the paternalism also exists, right? And then he even died, right? Because he dies, right? Doesn't he get killed? Right? He said, I'm saying, like, he died. Jesus dies, right? Or Obi-Wan, right? Gets killed. I mean, it's so fucking bullshit, right? And you see that, and Django's able to be unchained and unleashed, and he's taught this. And there's no way that I don't think that Tarantino doesn't see Christoph Waltz's character in that film as himself. He totally sees it as a version of himself. And so I wrap all that up to say the N-word thing has to deal, it shows how he thinks he's a champion for black people. He's given black people great shit. And he says it. Like some of these interviews that he did, I mean, without outright saying it, he's always suggesting it. There's a really bad interview. I wonder if you probably have seen this, where he starts talking in a black accent and like Jamie Foxx and them are there. You've seen that one, right? And that interview, I remember seeing that one, and I remember being like, there's two options here, and they're both bad. Either he's just your run of the mill dude who hangs out with a lot of black people and he thinks he can like, do some shit, right? And like I got my black friends, so I can put up a black face. Or black face, black voice, black face, kind of same shit. Or, yo, let me go up in this space with these black actors and like do some shit that's like a little over the top. And I know they're not gonna actually stop me because why would they stop me? I just made them in the biggest movie of the year, right? It's huge. And either direction is really, really nasty. But that's Tarantino.
He's like Michael Rappaport in Bamboozled. You know what I mean?
100%, yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. He's exactly the type of guy. I'm more black than you. Yeah.
Right? Well, when Joe Biden said that, he's like Joe Biden, right? If you don't vote for me, you're not black. If you don't go see Django, then you're not black.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Um, yeah, and I always found it funny that, that Django actually is a white savior movie. They try to pin this down on Green Book, which is not a great film. But it's not really a white savior movie. I mean, those guys, they're more like friends and they help each other, and it's okay. It was an okay movie, and for me, it wasn't problematic at all. I just think it was the Trump era, and they were looking for a culprit, someone who's responsible for, and but that's the irony. Django was that film. Django is it's um and the funny thing is that Christoph Waltz plays he plays just another Hans Landa, just on the other side. It's so crazy. It's the same tone. It's the same vibe. It's the same performance. It's crazy to me. And he dies in the film because he resists because he doesn't want to do something racist or bad, and then he has to
Right.
die.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that part. Thank you for
Yeah.
reminding me. Oh,
That's insane. That's so insane. I mean, it's so obvious and but but yeah, I mean, I do think, I mean, he Tarantino was like he was mainstream at that point. He was untouchable. So and I think Django is his most successful film to date.
which is
So
wild.
this is wild. And yeah, I mean, this is when all the stars aligned and he was like he was really the biggest director out there and he could do whatever he wanted and that's why uh he had to indulge himself and do his 65 millimeter film and which I even, I have to say I even enjoyed it. I watched it. I watched it on 70 millimeter, but at the same time I was kind of mad because here's this guy. He has the means to make a film, in ultra wide, whatever screen, and but then it all takes place in a hut. And this is such a FU to the audience, in my opinion. This is like I I can't do this. This is like Paul Thomas Anderson, doing one battle after another in VistaVision, and like 500 people in the world can afford to see it that way. This isn't, I mean, this isn't democracy. This is, I don't know what it is. I mean, it's privilege at first, and then it's masturbation or whatever. But I mean, if you're a guy like I forgot his name, it's Mark Jenkin, I think he's called. It's like a Scottish filmmaker or Welsh filmmaker or something, and he makes the small 16 millimeter films um, on the Welsh coast or the Scottish coast or something. I mean, that I buy. This is a guy who likes the physical aspect of film, the analog aspect of film, and he can, and I do buy that. I believe him. But when those guys do it, and most of us, they have to drive, 2 to 3 hours to watch the film as intended, or just watch the DCP. I mean, this is not about, I don't know, this is not about love of cinema or love of film. I don't know what it is. So that always bothered me, because I do like it when people, when filmmakers go, analog. Because I watched a lot of films, on 35, on 16 millimeter when, when I was a cinephile, when I had time to do that. And I do think it helped me shape my perspective on film, and it was great. But this is not that. This is privilege.
Yeah, him and Nolan's whole, film stock obsession. To me, it's actually heavily related to, I think, the old kind of hegemonic war that existed with how cinema was going to look and how it was going to be presented and who had control of the resources. Because the thing about film stock that I think people forget is that it has to be made, a lot of material that has to actually make it. There are times you can't get your hands on it because of material shortages, war. So it's almost like it's almost like a commodity, like a precious commodity at times. So it kind of goes into your idea about privilege. People like Nolan and Tarantino want to be kind of attached to this kind of like old prestige, and digital cameras for them don't have that. Um, they don't have that prestige, right? So for them to be prestigious, kind of connected to the kind of classical Western, and I don't mean like Westerns as a genre, but I mean like Western film, right? Kind of canon. If they were working on digital cameras, essentially they would not be part of it, right? To be part of it, they need to shoot on film. It's actually I find it very it's very much a kind of like empire kind of attitude, right? They want to be it's like I'm the number one soldier in the army, in the classical or the classic military. I need the big sword. I need Excalibur, right? Don't give me that little weak ass broadsword. I need the big one, right? And the sword that was, was forged of all these precious metals that come from around the planet that has diamonds on it and shit like that, King Arthur BS. So the film stock kind of represents this really, but they wouldn't actually understand this or think about this because to make film through the chemical process and all that type of shit, all the extraction that it came from. And I'm not saying this people shouldn't use film. That's not what I'm saying. But where it comes from, its roots are from like the Congo, but also just digital cameras. But like the kind of roots of how film was made, the chemical process, Manhattan, project, and all that type of stuff. Like it just situates for their kind of attitude, it situates them as a particular attitude towards like being part of the empire and being the spokespeople of empire. So they're going to be the spokespeople of empire. They need the kind of tools that empire used, to kind of stamp itself.
That's a good point. And Tarantino is certainly an empire director in a post-empire world.
Right.
And yeah, and that's probably that's one of the reasons that he um, that he's been criticized lately for many of his public outings and many of his decisions. And like I mean, this whole 10 movies shtick, that he wants to do. I mean, this is I mean, this kind of self-importance is, I mean, it's self-evident that it's yeah, kind of cringy and not very, I mean, not very interesting. And much more interesting is that, he was always he was speaking about, he's got his own cinema, and if he wants to, he can show Kill Bill in the full version of Kill Bill, um, and he wouldn't tell anyone. Yeah, he would just he would show it on a Friday, and that's it. But it's something precious because it's on film, and there's meaning to that. And like months later, he would just release the whole thing in theaters, on DCP. And and another thing, I mean, yes, he's a champion of cinema, but at the same time, he's got this deal with Netflix, and you can watch a much longer version of The Hateful Eight on Netflix, and so there's a lot of self-aggrandizing, there's a lot of mythologizing about himself, and there's a lot of the business aspect of it all. And I think action speaks louder than words. And I mean, it's a business for him.
Y- Yeah, and I think some of the long-term effects it has is it makes being a filmmaker about resource accumulation, resource control. Um, because what's not every then young filmmaker's dream? It would be to be able to be like Tarantino, right? And not necessarily make films like him, but to have the kind of resource ability, right? In order to, show a movie in your own theater, be able to kind of have partnerships, with different types of, streaming or screening or theaters, also camera companies, so forth and so on. So what the young filmmaker is then encouraged to do is just live their life trying to basically become George Lucas, right? Become powerful, right? To become a capitalist. Let's be real. And there will never be an attempt to kind of work in film in a way that's maybe like degrown from that kind of perspective. It's actually seen to be just not what film should ever be, right? Um, or if it ever was like something like people like Jonas Mekas or maybe some of these other or like the third cinema more political stuff, that's seen as like a thing from an older time that should never be revisited because it's less we've blown past that with like technological and the filmmaker must be to be a filmmaker must be highly resourced, highly close to resources of high financial and high capital accumulation and the ability to kind of like get you to basically to do everything you need. That's filmmaking. And anything less than that is not filmmaking. It's I mean, and you have political filmmakers who say things like this now, right? When they wouldn't have said this like 50 years ago, right? There was definitely a position against that kind of situating yourself with big capital that was seen as a negative amongst if you had a certain kind of political read. But now it's seen as like the only way to be a filmmaker is to be around like large amounts of capital. So you can have it yourself and or eventually control it yourself if you can become a mogul, like a Spielberg or a Lucas or so forth and so on.
Yeah, it's like, it was what Peter Watkins was constantly talking about, that you go to film school and you become an industry professional, and that means you don't question the industry, the means of production, and things like that. You just want to be part of it.
Yeah, you don't. You're definitely not encouraged to look at it, to question it. There is no materialist science that exists within even in film studies, it's a problem. Um, because what you just said, the production of film as a commodity, if it's ever questioned, it's questioned around things like representational politics, identity politics. If it's political, it's maybe it's situated around some exploitive things that might happen. But even then, like I remember there was like this discourse around Chloe Zhao's first movie where she did at the indigenous. reservation, right? And I remember that discussion like died really quickly because it became one of those things where it was like, well, it probably was a bit, it probably was a bit like weird that she did that, but it's a net positive because she's an Asian woman filmmaker who's now directing for Marvel, right? I mean, it becomes that. It becomes, I mean, or if you want to get real funky, they'll just apologize for Chloe Zhao and say, well, I mean, shit. Like, what else was she gonna do to be able to get into Hollywood? We know it's bad, but that's the social relations that exist for her, right? They'll limit it to that, right? And no analysis that, like, honestly, Chloe Zhao's a very smart person and a very savvy business person. She should know her father's a fucking billionaire. So she knows business. It's not like she don't understand business. Homegirl knows what she's doing. She's a very smart person, right? And this is very, very on purpose. She knew how to get in and she knew how to get herself up there. And she did exactly that code. She followed that code of filmmaking and rising as a filmmaker.
Yeah, I guess that's what you have to do if you want to be an industry professional and if you want to be part of the club. And yeah, the question is, will you lose yourself, along the way, or and or will you stay true to yourself? And coming back to Tarantino, I mean, what happened to him? I mean, did he lose himself or did he discover his true self?
Oh, I think it was always closer to the latter. I I mean, filmmaking in the United States. Here's what I will. Here's how I'll position this. Filmmaking in the United States has always been a pro-imperialist venture, right? And like large, right? You align yourself with a machine like Hollywood, which um, disseminates propaganda and a vision of America that allows America to be sustained by either really right wing pro America stuff or elastic kind of pieces that make America seem like it's self critical, right? And there's a mix often, and we can kind of go into like the different mixes of those things. But those maybe like the two big points. Yes, there's been counter movements in the United States, right? Some of them have been deeply political, some of them have not been, right? Some of them have just been like, you know, kind of auteur authors kind of cinema things. I want my freedom, my individual freedom to make what I want. Some of them have represented like groups, and you have different kinds of political strands within it, right? Some of them are very, very left wing, some of them are super left wing, so forth and so on, right? And they've operated in and outside of these systems based on different kind of chaotic politics, sometimes or very solid political lines. But someone like Tarantino, the minute he gets in, his whole position is finding a way to make himself attractive to the hegemonic order, right? Right. And you really have two options there. Your options are really follow the company line, like super like strict and hope that they pick you, or say, hey, you can like bend the company line more a little bit. Look at me. I'm gonna give you the new idea. So he's kind of like he had that whiz kid thing. Like him. I mean, this is kind of what Lucas provided, right? I'm probably thinking and it's been every decade. I mean, this is kind of what like Greta Gerwig has done recently, and she does her own version of this. They're finding it. So I don't think they lose anything. I think they've always been this way. I think what happens is they just get more refined, right? And they get smarter. I mean, I'll say it. Ryan Coogler's another version of it in a different way, right? I mean, and he went to USC. I mean, Coogler's whole game is figuring out a way to make a certain kind of agreeable product, right? And they're fine with it because what does it do? It makes Hollywood seem like it can encompass everything, even like black politics, Sinners, woo hoo hoo, right? Black Panther, woo hoo hoo, right? But Coogler, and he wouldn't say it how I'm saying it, but he would say, I think it's important to make stuff for us that could fit within Hollywood. That's an admission.
That's why the film wasn't called Fred Hampton, but Judas and the Black
And the Black
Messiah.
Messiah. Yeah, yeah, 100%. Well, 100%. I mean,
Yeah.
and look, I know the director of that very well personally. And it'll be the similar thing. He wouldn't see the problem in this, but he knew that. He knew he couldn't do the Fred Hampton biopic. And I don't even think he really had interest in it either. But the story of like the traitor, that's the more interesting one. And I'm not saying that guy isn't very interesting and shouldn't be studied. Granted, there's a lot more to study about him, but like that's the focus. Interesting.
Yeah. So, as a closing remark, what do you think? What will remain of Tarantino's body of work?
So I think I see one of two kind of lanes. The dominant lane that I think will still exist as America persists is I think that he helps define the possibility of filmmakers as we're still stuck in a kind of singular author kind of mode of filmmaking. Even people who consider themselves socially minded and social justice minded, or even think that he's probably quasi racist, right? They will still look at him as a figure to model pieces because when you're in that kind of author cinema position, you're still trying to find a way to do individualistic power. So they'll look at him as a kind of example of like someone who was able to achieve it, right? And whether they like his movies or not, I think is irrelevant. As much as they'll look at his kind of positioning. Critically, where his movies will lay, that's kind of tough. I don't know. I don't think about it that much as I wonder, um, like I could try to be generous and say as the years go on, people will just not think about it as interesting. But I don't know. I don't think so. I think people in America or in the West have a kind of like continued like resetting of like the kind of commodity fetishism of film. So you can have like a new kind of group get into him in like a decade. What I think could happen and probably will happen if what I'm saying does happen, I think any kind of real political counter movement will key in on Tarantino as one of the big problems and not for the reasons that people like Spike fixed on, right? The kind of limited scope. Because I think one of the lies that I think really became evident about Tarantino, and we didn't talk about this as much, was that he was like super independent. And like he in the 90s, he was thought as like an independent guy, right? And then, or we did talk about it a little bit as an independent guy in the 90s. When he went into the Django Inglorious and he went into, he got and really Kill Bill before that, the big studio money, he's essentially a Hollywood filmmaker, right? I mean, so what will then happen is if any kind of rejection of like the Hollywood structure will have to look at how he situated himself and like the kind of long lie because he also shows that quote unquote the independent landscape is really just kind of minor leagues to get into the kind of like larger studio system. So I think a lot of the problems that we have, um, in terms of like the festival system, there's gonna be no way to like not look at him and situate him as like one of the examples of how bad those systems are, and what they produce. So, you know, legacy wise, I just think it's kind of where you situate yourself, right? Um, and I think hopefully as there's a growing movement towards like more materialist reads of cinema and conjunctual reads of cinema, people will kind of look at Tarantino honestly as like an empire schlock artist. Because he's not very he's there's like filmmakers, like I'll say this like in close, even someone like Scorsese, who I liked a lot more when I was younger, right? I'm not saying I can't stand him, it's nothing like that. Like, what I was gonna say was there's times with Scorsese and I watch the film and I go, this is very interesting. It's a very interesting like study. He's just not very, I don't know. Scorsese's just not very he's not brave. He doesn't have a
Right.
bravery. Yeah, he doesn't have a bravery. Um, but I can acknowledge the filmmaking in ways and acknowledge moments of real interesting pursuit. Right? Tarantino, I watched it. I'm like this is fine or bad or really bad. Right? So yeah, I say all this to say, yeah, it's yeah, bleh. That's where it'll be left.
Yeah, so farewell to the Empire Schlock artists.
Yes.
Yes, this was a blast.
Yes,
Mtume
it
Gant,
was.
thank you very much
Yes.
for coming on.
Oh, thank you for having me. I appreciate it very much.
I haven't seen you in church lately.
One must not flirt with one's destiny.
Good shot. Good shot. Good shot. Good shot. Good shot. Good shot.
Stop it! You're ignorant.